Afternoon. My name is Marla Jaksch, and I'm an assistant professor at the College of New Jersey in the Women and Gender Studies Department. And I'm so happy to be here and a part of this conference I've been getting, or symposium. And especially after this afternoon's talk, got a lot of incredible ideas, and I can't wait to chat more about that. My particular project about the Virtual Freedom Trail project began while I was in Tanzania. I was there on a Fulbright, and all of my work was stolen. So the work that I had been doing was stolen out of my home, and it was at that point I started to think about, well, I was not easily able to upload everything to a cloud or to save it in another location. So what happens when you lose all these kinds of materials? And and the connections to the state of archives in Tanzania in general. I had been doing some archival research, and while there, national archives were being sold off. So one archive was in the back of a tractor trailer, and I went to this tractor trailer and everything had tipped over. So for me, it was a very interesting metaphor for losing all of my work. But I also had wanted to visit a particular location in Tanzania, so it opened up the possibility for me to do so. So during the apartheid struggle, Tanzania played host to a number of freedom fighters, and there were a number of camps all across the country, and they were not necessarily acknowledged or known at the time for the safety of those freedom fighters. But I was able to travel to Morogoro, and while I was there at the Solomon Malongo Freedom School in Tanzania, noticed that some of the things that were there from this ANC school were still preserved. And many of those referenced women's contributions to this time, although I had read very little about the collaboration, and in particular the feminist collaboration between Tanzanian and South African women at that time. So there was, what I also was able to find was that there was a lack of policy in regards to this type of material, what to do with these buildings, what to do with the material that was left behind. And in some ways it was quite shocking because the ANC was known for getting rid of all of its extant materials when it left. So for me, I wanted to know a little bit more about this history. And so I began after that working with a group of students at the University of Dar es Salaam and a feminist organization, the Tanzania Gender Networking Program, in order to start collecting some oral histories in a digital format. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is the Virtual Freedom Trail project as it stands now, and it's mostly in our imaginary. We're collecting all of this data, but we're looking for a platform to host it, right? So for the things that you all discussed this afternoon about what makes new media and technology unique is that it can allow for a lot of messiness and flexibility. And so as a non-trained geographer, and I'm not a programmer, trying to link up with people who might be able to assist us in envisioning a program where we could actually map women's contributions to the liberation struggle as we move back and forth across the continent. So in 2011, Tanzania marked the 50th anniversary from liberation, and so did many other African countries. Building up to this momentum occasion, there were various conferences, speeches, workshops, celebrations, and discussions regarding commemorations of those who were involved in the liberation struggle, and a discussion about what had been left to be done. But a closer look at the content of the commemorative events and materials in Tanzania revealed a continued hegemony in regards to what counts worthy as telling, remembering, and whose stories matter. There remains a deep ambivalence regarding women's contributions to the liberation struggle. So what we see in Tanzania and across the continent is a pattern of forgetting regarding women's roles in this work in favor of a more uniform representation of the liberation movement that in essence serves to erase women's political agency. The liberation struggle in Tanzania did not end with Tanganyika independence in 1961 or in joining with the islands of Zanzibar to create Tanzania in 1964, and neither did the women's contributions. For more than 40 years, Tanzania sustained a leading role in Pan-African struggle for continent-wide independence, especially for South Africa, in which women continued to play more than a supporting role. It is this legacy, that of women during the struggle to end colonial rule, and the significance of the location of Tanzania as the scene for much of this activity, that first interested me. While relearning the history of women's contributions and the reasons for women's continuous marginalization in this history led me to believe that previous frameworks perhaps were not adequate. It became clear that creative and emergent technologies have begun to play a significant role in reshaping how we memorialize, theorize, and historicize women's role in African liberation struggles. In a 2012 Pambazuka news article about whether women in Africa are now occupying new movements, the author pinpoints that precise contradiction, the sense of utter shock that many women are playing such a large role and visible role in many recent acts of mass civil resistance, as if this has never happened before. According to Hakina Abbas, even though women have been widely involved in past liberation struggles, despite this, and I quote, "what is consistently disputed is the participation of women in acts of civil resistance, while the question of role is posed. An important question of power remains. In the age of Twitter, Facebook, and rapid diffusion of images around the world, the participation of women on the front lines of protests and in acts of mass civil resistance can no longer be disputed." So the goal of the Virtual Freedom Trail project was to engage those women who had been involved in liberation struggles with those students who are interested in learning, but also learning more about the technology. And it seeks to counter this particular pattern of forgetting and provides alternative means for telling parts of this history. And I'm drawing specifically from Tanzanian women activists, especially Bibi Titi Mohammed, to illustrate how their involvement in the Tanganyikan African National Union shaped the party and was essential to the success of the liberation struggle. The project centers on making visible women's own definitions of themselves first and foremost as political actors, rather than women, and what it means to identify and how to represent them as such. This project examines archival, visual, textual representations of women political activists in Tanzania, including female anti-apartheid and liberation activists living in exile in Tanzania, both during and after the struggle for apartheid and colonialism. So one of the things that we found with the students was that there is a use of phone technology that's readily available. So at the University of Dar es Salaam, power is inconsistent, so having access to lights or computers is virtually impossible. But people typically have access to cell phones and smartphones. And so as that capacity to be able to use cell phones to do more and more and less of a reliance on other forms of technology emerged, students wanted to imagine different ways that they could use the cell phone and perhaps iPads to be able to use different kinds of technology to map women's contributions. So through the use of thick and differential mapping, the students and I examine women's participation in the struggle for democracy, how it's represented and remembered in this context, and through mapping commemorative and heritage sites. And in the context of both countries' urgent and ongoing debates about national transformation and women's continued inequality, the complex history of political identities and recognition for women has largely been forgotten. The methods used in our project include feminist approaches to GIS, which may be better able to understand these activists conceptualize themselves not only temporally, but through their social relations, but by highlighting how space and place were also central to their development as political agents, and in profoundly shaping the type of political organization that TANU became. Many of the women involved in the development in TANU were Muslim, semi-literate, and therefore highly restricted in their movement in public at the time, and yet were able to recruit in a very short period of time thousands of members. In turning our attention to the spaces that women occupy and to map the spheres of their influence, we begin to challenge the patterns of forgetting that make visible more comprehensible the trail to freedom, through the living rooms and kitchens, marketplaces and alleyways, to the stadiums and political halls that served as political education and recruitment sites. So one of the things that we've been able to do so far is to at least address some of the reasons why there continues to be a significant erasure or patterns of forgetting. And so what we've been able to find at this particular moment in time is that, at least historically, there have been Eurocentric or masculine historiographies that continue and repeatedly silence women's contributions. They just don't see them. Nationalist historiographies also disappear women in this process. What I also was able to find is that oftentimes Swahili written documents do acknowledge to some degree the active participation that women did have. However, when those are translated, if they're ever translated, women again disappear in that process. So there seems to be a number of reasons why these erasures occur. Also, in terms of Western feminist methodologies, there have been a number of gender and racial ideologies that seem to also make it impossible for women to be visible through the construction of the other. Now, in some ways, a lot of the writings that we do know about early women who were involved in the Tanzanian liberation struggle are written from the perspective of women who came to Tanzania as the husbands or as the spouses of British military. And so they write a lot about those experiences, but oftentimes in ways that are really threatening. I mean, they see the political work that women are doing as a highly problematic thing. Okay. We also know that a lot of just find it here. Lost my space, sorry. A lot of the images and representations that do exist of women as a part of the liberation struggle often center around a theme of mothers with guns. So if they are a part of an armed liberation, and a piece that's actually circulated are women in this really very overdetermined representation. And so the students were able to find other representations, but those representations often took another form. And those are the forms of conga. So I do have an example of a conga that's there. And these, kuanga in Swahili means to wrap, and it's a piece of fabric that women often wear. And so these particular pieces of fabric were also ways of women to communicate with one another. But often men and those in colonial positions of power did not see these pieces of material as significant or important and did not interpret what was being said. So this was a way for women to actually mobilize politically. A lot of these congas don't exist as much anymore, but what we do know, and the women do tell us about the fact that they spent a lot of time. This was an actual opportunity for women to assert their voices into a public sphere, because they're walking in these particular places, and congas have the message written on the bottom of the conga. So as they move through these spaces, whether they are in their homes or whether in political locations, these messages are circulating. So after independence, women continued to circulate and ask, why have we been forgotten? So while what we were able to find is that women were able to recruit when men were afraid to be a part of TANU, and a lot of the organizations used to overthrow the colonial government, women were able to circulate in a way that men were not able to do. And so while we have this history and we have this documentation that tells one particular story of this armed overthrow, we know that there were other things that made TANU possible. So the goal for us is to be able to link up all of these materials, right? The oral histories with women's expressive culture, whether it be through the congas, also dance and music that women used, to be able to create this virtual Freedom Trail that will serve not just as an archive, but also as a community, as a museum, as a living history, a place that could continually adapt as the technology adapted. Currently, we're using the ArcGIS in order to be able to map the physical locations. And what makes this particular method really useful is that it allows you to be able to embed images, text, narrative, etc. So it opens up that space. Typically when we think of GIS, or when I think of GIS not coming from geography, is that I typically think of it as a quantitative research method that doesn't allow for that kind of fluidity or flexibility. But there are now methods that are being adapted or adopted that allow us to do a lot more. So the site is not currently live yet, but this is a screenshot of this beginning research that does have the oral histories documented, some of this archival materials, and so I'm hoping that in the coming days that we're going to be able to adapt some of the things that we've learned in order to create a more expansive representation of women's political contributions, in part because there is this sense, right, that when we erase women's political agency historically, there's a connection to what is possible in the future, for right now, for the present moment. And there is a lot of work that's being done in the development field that talks about empowering young women, which completely does not address any of the issues of women's political empowerment, and focuses a lot on smaller micro enterprises. These smaller enterprises don't necessarily allow them to be able to overcome the big impediments that are in their lives. So in many ways, this project is meant to be open and not a part of a major institution that's open source, that is working with a major feminist organization there in order to provide more political autonomy and agency. So, thank you.